Hello, everyone. On this session of our Theory of Constraints series, we will be focusing on the Theory of Constraints Focusing Process. In our previous session, we talked about the importance of this process as one of the key processes of Theory of Constraints, and we will talk about this process this time in our next part of this Theory of Constraints sessions. We will talk about the second key process of the theory of constraints, which is the process of ongoing improvement. Today, we will cover some background about the focusing process. What are the keys for success? What is the process itself? And we will review each one of its steps. So, one of the theory of constraints basic assumptions is that every system naturally strives to improve, and if it's not the natural state of the system, it must or it should be the natural state of the system. It is because systems that do not improve cannot sustain. However, you can't improve without changing. Change or improvement requires doing things differently. You can't do a strategic change without a good leadership. And the importance of leadership is to know how to lead such a change process correctly. The challenge starts with the fact that there are multitude options of change, multitude options of what to improve in the system. And oftentimes, because leadership is not clear which one of these changes is more likely to deliver the effects required on the system performance, i.e., achieving more goal units, the leadership decides to choose more than one such opportunity. And therefore, the result is that the attention of the management is spread very thinly across too many initiatives. And when too many initiatives demand attention, it is highly likely that none of them can be executed good enough. So even in the case that one of these alternatives was an appropriate, good alternative, it is not fully exploited. And all the improvements, all the change efforts, all the attention dedicated into change processes that do not result with the system generating more goal units actually is not an improvement. So it is wasting a very important asset of the company. It's not only the theory of constraints point of view. It started ages ago. You can see Socrates saying that the secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but building the new. And Bill Gates, as of today, talking about that my success is part of it certainly, is that I focused on a few things. So how do we focus on a few things? For that, the leadership team needs to be very clear on what area requires their maximum attention. Management always will place attention on more than one thing. But the question is that of all the things that require attention, where should attention get the highest priority? The management or the leadership team must be clear what in this area needs to be changed, what should be done instead of what is currently being done, and it has to be very clear about how to acquire, recruit, the commitment and the engagement of everyone relevant within the organization. Because mostly changes do not happen just because we want to. They happen because we are able to persuade others to assume responsibility and commitment to make it a reality. Many years ago, this book was published, The Theory of Constraints and its Implications to Management Accounting. It was research done about the effectiveness of the theory of constraints, specifically on throughput accounting. And one of the key conclusions of this research was that the core idea of the theory of constraints is that every system must have at least one constraint. And it is very easy to prove because otherwise you could generate infinite goal units. And because the constraint limiting you from making whatever the system strives to get more of, either you manage the constraint or they manage you. The constraint determines the output of the system, whether they are acknowledged and managed or not. This realization is very, very important, and actually naturally leads to the focusing process of the theory of constraints, and naturally leads to the first step of this process. So the first step of the process is, as suggested by the research previously stated, is to know where your constraint is. If you do not know it, you cannot manage it. If you cannot manage it, it will manage you. So the first step of the focusing process is know where your constraint is. Know what limits your company or your organization from generating more goal units. When you know where it is, the second step is to try and make the utmost possible goal units from the existing constraint. So find a way to exploit the constraint. Because the constraint is only part of the system, it is mandatory and critical that the rest of the system cannot operate in a way that jeopardizes the exploitation of the constraint. So the third step is to subordinate the rest of the system to the way we are exploiting or decided to exploit the constraint. When the current constraint is delivering the maximum possible goal units, we come to the step of adding ability to the current constraint of the company. Adding ability, creating more capability to do more goal units may result with the constraint moving to another place in the system, which will call for repeating the focusing process again. What we will do today is we will try to understand a little bit each one of these steps and what does this practically mean for you if you want to apply this process to your system. So let's start with the first step. Every system can be drawn in a very simple way. It has an input coming into the system is doing something with that input, and there is an output. Through the output, the system is generating goal units. The constraint of the system, and the system that we look at must be holistic, therefore it must start from the input and end all the way the output of the system. The constraint of the system limits the system from generating more goal units. There is no mystery about where the constraint is. There are only 4 options where it can be. The constraint can be in the input, meaning the system cannot get sufficient input. It has the right capacity, it has the right demand on the other side, but cannot generate sufficient input to fulfill that. It can be in the output. The system does not have enough demand. In the output, it can come in 2 ways. Either there is not enough demand, and in that case, we will call it a market constraint, or it does have enough demand, however, does not have enough sales. The conversion is poor, and in that case, we will call it a sales constraint. Lastly, the constraint can be in the system itself. The system has enough input, it has enough demand, it has enough sales, however, it cannot satisfy the whole demand placed on it. Something within the system is limiting the company or the system from generating more goal units. Once we identify where the constraint is, internally, externally, and where externally, the second step is to decide how to exploit the constraint. We have an assumption here. We assume that commonly, almost always, systems in the current mode of operation are wasting part of the constraint capabilities, and therefore by appropriate changes in the system, they could generate more goal units with the existing constraint. To exploit the constraint, it means that we need to move from the way we are working today that limits us, or this negatively affects our constraint exploitation, and to change it to a new way of operating against this constraint. Sometimes these changes are very obvious, are very clear. At other times, we need to use the second core theory of constraints process, which we'll discuss in the next part of our series. I'll give an example when it is very, very simple. If we have a sales constraint, then our problem is conversion. If the problem is conversion, it is relatively simple to find changes in the way we are handling our sales opportunities that will improve our conversion. If not, we will need to dig deeper. Once we know how to exploit the constraint, or before we know that, let's just go into the different types of changes. If the constraint is in sales, we need to change the way we are managing conversion. If the constraint is in the market, it means that we do not have enough demand. To have enough demand, we must bring to the market a new value proposition that will affect the market perception of our value and therefore will enable creation of new demand. When the constraint is inside the operational process of the company, what we need to change is the way we are using capacity, specifically at the location where the constraint is currently situated. And if the constraint is in supply, we must understand that when we buy, we also sell. And therefore, we need to create a value proposition for our suppliers. These are the type of changes required. And as mentioned, they can be very easy and straightforward to identify, and sometimes they can be very challenging to identify, and will call for a deeper analysis in order to answer. The next step is subordination. Now, when we know how to exploit the constraint, we must make sure the rest of the system cannot jeopardize this. This is commonly the most challenging step in the process. When the constraint is in sales, subordination is normally the easiest, as it requires almost solely changes within the sales organization. When the constraint is in the market, it's normally the most complicated change because subordination requires a synchronization of almost any subsystem of the entire system, all components or entities. When the constraint is in the company, subordination requires synchronization of at least a few internal entities. And when the supply is the constraint, subordination involves primarily purchasing, logistics, and finance. So the more entities participate in subordination, the more challenging the subordination is. In all cases, it is necessary to use the theory of constraints' second core process to define the changes and to know what needs to be done to implement them. When we come to elevation, when all potential of the existing constraint is exploited, the system still has a target to generate more goal units. This time, we need to add more ability to the area where the constraint is. When the constraint is in the market, we need to add market. When the constraint is in sales, we will need to add sales capacity. When the constraint is internal, we will need to add execution capacity. And when the constraint is in the supply, we will need to add supply sources. It might be that elevation is not possible, and as the constraint immediately moved to a new location. If not, it is likely to move there after the elevation. And then we go to the last step. As the constraint moves, the focusing process needs to be repeated. Do we know where the new constraint is? Now we need to ask ourselves how to exploit it, how to subordinate the rest of the system, up to the point where we will need to elevate or move to the next constraint. There is one important consideration you need to keep in mind. If we do too frequent changes at this magnitude, it may lead to confusion and lack of trust of the people in the company. It is advisable, therefore, not to allow the process to repeat itself frequently. To not repeat the process frequently requires a solid strategy. We will discuss this strategy in the strategy session. That's all for today. I hope that you learned a lot. Thank you very much. Goodbye.